All right, one of the big stories carrying over from yesterday, and as I said, many years on, in a statement released last night, Tiger Brands says it is committed to resolving the listeriosis class action lawsuit, which has now dragged on for 6 years. Victims of the world's deadliest listeriosis outbreak are now calling for criminal charges to be instituted against the company after scientific evidence showing Tiger Brands is responsible for the disaster. 218 people died while more than 1,000 others fell ill. Let's bring in health and human rights activist Mark Heywood, who is among those calling for accountability. He joins us this afternoon. Mark, it's good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. And we were live on you just yesterday. You were on our program giving the closing remarks in what was quite a devastating account of how the listeriosis outbreak has impacted just one of many families. I'm talking about Montla Ngobeni and her daughter Teto, who is now 6 years old, contracted listeriosis when she was 18 days old. It's a human face to perhaps an issue that I would argue many South Africans have forgotten about.
Good afternoon, Michelle. Yes, I think many South Africans have forgotten about it. And we need to remember that 2017-18, 218 people died as a result of contracting listeriosis, and upwards of 1,000 people were harmed, were made sick, were disabled as a result of eating products that came from polony that was manufactured by Tiger Brands at its factory in Polokwane. As I said yesterday, if we need to quantify the cost of life and what constitutes a disaster, 218 deaths is on the same scale as the 144 people who lost their lives at Life Esidimeni. And those who have survived from Tiger Brands live with similar traumas. You mentioned Montla Ngobeni. Montla got listeriosis. She's had to undergo double hip replacements. Her daughter was infected at 18 when she was 18 days old. Her daughter has hydrocephalus, has to have a shunt moving liquid from her brain, and is unable to control her bowels. And you can imagine that for a little beautiful, I must say, beautiful, lively 6-year-old girl, but who has to go to school with those type of difficulties. So for me, what is most moving about this is, in fact, the human tragedy, and it's the human tragedy that must motivate us to ensure that this matter is resolved in the interests of justice.
As you say, Mark, 218 people killed, upwards of 1,000 people survived, but still suffer. And of course, the very important thing to point out here is that of those upwards of 1,000, disproportionately affected are poor South Africans, the majority of whom are Black South Africans.
That's precisely the point. Polony is a cheap, relatively affordable foodstuff that is high in protein. And it is a foodstuff that is most commonly eaten by people who don't have a lot of money. And in addition to that, poor people, many people live with HIV. HIV is a cofactor. Weakened immune systems mean people are more predisposed to infection with listeria and then to developing listeriosis. And again, as we pointed out yesterday, listeriosis is a very serious bacterial infection that kills 1/3 of people who are infected. The flip side of that is that there's a huge responsibility on the companies that manufacture these foodstuffs to make sure that their factories comply with the highest standards of hygiene, to make sure that their factories comply with the law, and to make sure that the foods that they produce and send out onto the market and which get distributed all over the country are safe for consumption. In this instance, these foodstuffs were not safe for consumption, and they led to 218 deaths and many people getting sick, which again is why we put the blame at the door, the blame for actually criminal negligence, if we are to speak frankly, at the door of Tiger Brands.
I want to just go through some of the opening remarks that Richard Spoor made at that briefing yesterday. Richard Spoor, attorneys, of course, representing the 1,000 people who have been impacted by the listeriosis outbreak. And he says, because I think it's important for us to clarify, Mark, that this is not ethical blame that is being put at the door of Tiger Brands. This is based on scientific fact. Of course, the ethics come into play, but this is based on science. It's not. We're not just talking about these airy-fairy ideas of what the right thing is to do here. But Richard Spoor says new evidence shows Tiger Brands was wholly responsible for the outbreak of this foodborne disease. Scientific evidence shows Tiger Brands' responsibility for the outbreak. It borders on certainty. It is evidence beyond reasonable doubt. The other issue for me, and I've got the Tiger Brands comment here in front of me, Richard Spoor also says this evidence has been available since 2020 when the National Institute for Communicable Diseases published this report. Now, Tiger Brands, in its statement, 6 years later, says it wants to ensure a resolution of the listeriosis class action suit is reached in the shortest possible time. It has been many, many years later now. And it says the investigation into the outbreak became available, the records became available in February of 2024.
Well, that's not quite true, because an article was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the New England Journal of Medicine is one of the best most recognized medical journals in the world, in February 2020. And that article, based upon the investigation conducted by the National Institute for Communicable Diseases, proved conclusively at that time that the source of the listeriosis outbreak was this factory in Polokwane. So it's not true to say that the evidence only became available earlier this year. There was sufficient evidence 4 years ago to link that factory to the deaths and to the harm that was incurred by hundreds of people. What we do have now is just further and more detailed evidence through genomic sequencing that shows at a probability, I think Richard Spoor said, of 93%, that the people who died and that the people who got sick because of products that they ate that came from that factory. You know, it's a little bit technical and very, very scientific, but the proof is there. It is beyond it is beyond any doubt. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. It is beyond any doubt at all what caused those deaths and what caused that illness.
So the other issue becomes that when we were in the grips of the listeriosis outbreak, and investigations were being done to try and find the source of this foodborne disease, at no stage, and Mark, you'll have some of this detail, but at no stage for 16 months, says Richard Spoor, Tiger Brands manufactured and distributed polony. Despite the outbreak, they never interrogated themselves as potential perpetrators of this outbreak.
Absolutely. So the facts, as I remember them, are that the outbreak of listeriosis was late 2016, early 2017. People began to get sick and people began to die. We were aware that there was an outbreak. The Department of Health began to try to trace the source of the outbreak. There were health warnings that were issued. We know enough about listeriosis and the listeria bacteria to know what the probable causes and sources where this type of thing can come from. And nothing was done. And the factory itself was only closed in, I think, March 2018, after the NICD basically tracked it down, a bit like you track down a criminal in a criminal investigation because of an outbreak of listeriosis amongst children at a creche in Soweto that could be directly linked to polony that was being given to those children at that creche that could be directly tracked back to this particular factory. And at that point, the factory was visited by the NICD. It was ordered that it be closed. And after it was closed, within months, the listeriosis outbreak was over. It was declared over in September 2018. And the point that Richard Spoor and the lawyers are making is that if Tiger Brands had acted responsibly 6 months or 12 months earlier, then it would have been possible to prevent further deaths and prevent further illness.
Yeah.
So that's why Richard Spoor, the lead attorney, describes Tiger Brands' conduct in this matter as reckless and negligent and of deserving extra compensation for the people who have been affected, because it is wrongful.
And unconscionable was another word that he used.
Unconscionable.
I'm not a scientist, but this makes a lot of sense to me. Some of the detail that Richard Spoor announced yesterday, genetic sequencing of listeria showed that over 90% of the people who tested positive for the disease had one specific strain. I just want to go back to this issue of the Polokwane facility. It had one specific strain, so it must have come from one specific source. And that's, of course, when the NICD did that sample study. And they found that the Polokwane facility of Tiger Brands was responsible. So you tell us, Mark, and Richard Spoor and everyone involved, and the facts tell us that this has been common knowledge. There was that report that was published in the journal. Despite all of this overwhelming evidence, which is now years old, right? The evidence has been there for many, many years. Tiger Brands still refuses to settle the case. In fact, the findings that you and I have been talking about, even Tiger Brands' own testing confirmed these findings by the NICD.
Quite right. Everything that you've said is true and correct and tragic. You've mentioned in this report, in our discussion, that Tiger Brands issued a statement last night saying that they are committed to resolving this issue. My response is, well, that's welcome, but it's not good enough. Because when are you going to resolve this issue? How are you going to resolve this issue? In what way are you going to resolve this issue? Do you accept liability? Are you going to issue an apology to the people of this country? Are you going to issue an apology to the families who lost family members, to people like the Ngobenis who are suffering to this day? These are the questions that we still need answered from Tiger Brand. What I'm afraid of is that they think that they can just weather 2 or 3 days of bad publicity as a result of the press conference we held yesterday, and then they will go back to trying to obstruct justice, to trying to delay justice. And whilst they obstruct and delay justice, people continue to suffer. Again, going back to the Ngobeni family, they have had to sell their house to pay 700,000 rand in medical bills. They continue to incur medical costs. They continue to live with illness and with anxiety, and in Teto's case, with indignity as a result of this. Meanwhile, this big company, this extremely rich and large company, escapes responsibility. It is just not acceptable.
And Teto is 6 years old now, and her mother described in heartbreaking detail how she is living through every day, has no control of her bowels. She's got this shunt in her head that is constantly draining fluid from her brain. Her mother herself has had a hip replacement. She also had listeriosis at the time of giving birth. And again, this is just one example of one family and how they've been impacted. Important to note as well, Mark, that over 50% of the infections during the outbreak were in newborns, and those who survived continue to suffer. Tiger Brands, in its statement, tells us the experts' review of the files remains ongoing. I'm not sure what that means years later. It also says it will, the legal team and attorneys in the class action suit continue to attend pre-trial preparations. Essentially, it's saying this class action lawsuit must go ahead. It continues to resist, I think is fair to say, Mark, any settlement. And one of the statements you made yesterday was, why do we have to put these families who have been through so much over the past 6 years, put them through another trial. Who knows how long that will take? In fact, your call to Tiger Brands was settle in September, now.
Yes, that was my call, settle in September. You know, Michelle, I've worked on health and human rights and these type of issues for many years. I have, for example, seen the trauma the life many families had to relive when they went through the arbitration, when they went through the inquest. I've seen the trauma that the family of little Michael Kamape, who drowned in a pit toilet in Limpopo, went through in all of the drawn-out legal proceedings. I've seen, you know, the fears, the anxiety, the uncertainty that legal processes often give. And where there is absolutely no question about liability and responsibility, why put people through that? Why put people through that? Is all you are doing is adding to the pain. What people need now is certainty, is justice, is compensation, is enough money to pay for expert medical support to try to alleviate pain and suffering. That is all that is required from Tiger Brand now. And if they insist on going to court, then stop obstructing, get to court in the soonest time possible, and let's have a definitive judgment on this, even though the evidence is definitive as it stands and as we talk today.
Mark Heywood, as usual, it is the poorest among us, the most vulnerable, that suffer the brunt of cases like this. Mark Heywood, thank you for joining us this afternoon. He is a human rights and health activist as we continue to track this story around extortion, and the many, many lives have been impacted. The statement from Tiger Brands ends saying Tiger Brands is not in a position to comment further.